Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are setting off on an absolutely wild biological journey. We're going to trace the path from a single microscopic egg, literally no bigger than a grain of rice, all the way up to the breathtaking complexity of an entire hive mind. You know, we so often look at bees as just busy little insects buzzing around our gardens, but by the end of this, I promise you'll see them in a completely different light. We're going to unpack their intricate architecture, some seriously dramatic cellular transformations, and the collective intelligence that makes a honeybee colony one of the absolute most fascinating structures in nature.
But first, I want you to think about this mystery. How exactly does a simple wooden box filled with insects manage to regulate its internal temperature with way more precision than a modern smart home thermostat? Seriously, whether there's a freezing blizzard or a boiling heat wave outside, the inside of that hive remains perfectly stable. It is a total engineering marvel. And to truly understand how this superorganism pulls it off, we first have to understand the tiny architects that build it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The honeybee caste system.
Every single honeybee hive is built on a very strict three-part social structure, and you can actually see the distinct physical differences between them. You have the queen, the worker, and the drone. Now, the queen has this noticeably larger, elongated midsection and abdomen. And unlike the workers, she doesn't have pollen baskets on her legs, and she totally lacks wax glands. Even her stinger is entirely different. It's smoother, curved, and totally reusable, unlike the barbed stinger of a worker bee. The workers are the smallest of the bunch, while the drones, which are the males, are much bulkier with these massive compound eyes.
So how do these distinct castes actually come to be? Well, it's the queen who pulls the strings. As eggs pass through her ovary, she controls whether a particular egg gets fertilized or not. And that one single decision drastically alters the insect's entire biological timeline. An unfertilized egg is destined to become a drone, and that takes about 24 days to fully mature. A fertilized egg, however, becomes female. That's either a worker, taking 21 days, or a queen, who practically races through her development in just 16 days.
Moving right along this section 2, 4 stages of metamorphosis.
And this brilliantly illustrates the journey. Honeybees are holometabolous insects, which is just a fancy scientific way of saying they undergo a complete physical metamorphosis, kind of like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. We start with stage 1, the tiny egg, which lasts for the first 3 days. Then it hatches into a larva, which is essentially just a little eating machine from days 4 through 9. After that is stage 3, the pupa, lasting from day 10 to 20 for a worker bee. Finally, at stage 4, around day 21, the fully formed adult bee chews its way right through the wax cap to emerge into the hive.
But we really need to focus on that pupal stage for a second, because the visual you should picture in your head is this visceral, highly dramatic cellular metamorphosis happening completely out of sight, sealed tight under a wax cap. Inside that cell, the larva spins a thin cocoon, and its internal structures literally break down. The larval intestine and heart tubes are degraded and completely rebuilt from scratch using undifferentiated stem cells. Up in the head, the optic and antenna lobes of the brain are developing out of nowhere. The entire body's pigmentation shifts from a milky white to dark. And here's just a fantastic detail. You know that iconic yellow banding we all associate with bees? It actually comes from the fine hairs covering the bee's body, not its skin. The skin underneath is naturally dark.
Which brings us to section 3, making a queen bee.
We know how a standard worker bee develops, but what about the queen? What are the special circumstances needed to create the absolute sole reproductive female of the entire colony? Well, a worker and a queen both start as perfectly identical fertilized female eggs. The difference? It is entirely dietary. Soon-to-be workers are fed worker jelly, a diet that includes some royal jelly, but only for the very first 2 days of their larval stage. Future queens, on the flip side, are exclusively fed royal jelly throughout their entire larval period. This incredibly nutrient-rich substance is secreted directly from a specialized area called the hypopharyngeal glands of adult worker bees. And that specific diet alone is what activates the genetic pathways that turn a normally sterile worker into a fertile queen.
I absolutely love this quote from Professor Boris Baer because it grounds this complex biology in a really familiar human metaphor. He says you can think of it as something like Buckingham Palace. There is a dedicated group of bees focused entirely on raising the queen. It's not just a random insect nursery happening in the dark. It's a highly coordinated, incredibly intentional effort by the colony to secure its own future. If they don't get the queen's rearing exactly right, the entire colony loses its ability to reproduce and will eventually collapse.
Let's zoom out a bit for section 4, the hive as superorganism.
Just visually immerse yourself in the rich texture of the honeycomb for a second. Look at how closely packed these thousands of individuals are, constantly bustling over the cells. When you have tens of thousands of individual insects completely merging their efforts, they create an entity capable of maintaining steady, precise internal conditions. This is a biological process known as homeostasis. Exactly like how your own human body regulates its temperature, the hive functions as a single, living, breathing organism.
And that perfectly sets up Section 5, Masters of Hive Thermoregulation.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the hive protects its most vulnerable asset, the developing brood of eggs, larvae, and pupae. Adult bees are actually fairly adaptable to different temperatures, but the developing brood, they are what scientists call stenothermic. They can only survive and properly develop within a staggeringly strict temperature range. During the pupal period, that temperature must be kept at exactly 35 degrees Celsius, with a tiny, tiny variation of just half a degree. That's it. Extended deviations from that exact number can cause severe physical defects, disrupt brain organization, and drastically increase mortality.
So, the big question is, how on earth do they maintain this exact temperature? Just picture the physical mechanics required to precisely heat and cool a large, drafty wooden box, completely regardless of the wild weather outside. They pull it off through this interlaced web of behavioral and physiological responses. Step 1 is generating heat. When it's too cold, workers will actually contract their thoracic flight muscles without even moving their wings, generating metabolic heat like tiny little radiators. They will literally crawl into empty cells next to the brood just to warm them up. Step 2 is heat shielding. When it gets too hot, young workers passively absorb the heat by pressing their bellies against the hot surfaces between the heat source and the brood cells. And step 3 is evaporative cooling. Workers will fan their wings rapidly to push hot air out of the nest, spreading water droplets around the hive to create a highly sophisticated air conditioning system. So the crucial point here comes from a really fascinating recent finding published in the Peer Community Journal. For a long time, we naturally assumed that a bigger colony with more adult bees would be better at regulating temperature, simply because they have more workers on hand. But researchers found that mean brood temperature is actually positively linked to the amount of brood itself, not the number of adult bees. The brood is the stimulus. The sheer presence and amount of developing young acts as the primary thermostat dial, practically commanding the workers to maintain that strict temperature accuracy.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. When you look at a honeybee, are you really looking at an individual insect? Or, given how their entire development is controlled by the collective, and how they seamlessly merge together to regulate the hive's temperature, just as precisely as a mammal regulates its own blood, are you really just looking at a single cell inside a massive, buzzing, warm-blooded superorganism? It really does change how you view the natural world just outside your window. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the incredible science happening all around us.